Hello, welcome back to Mastering Statistics. We're continuing on with analysis of variance. We're going to talk about the next most important calculation in Anova. It's called the sum of squares of errors. So it's a very similar concept to what we talked about in the last section, but it is very distinctly different. This is what usually trips people up and what makes Anova hard to understand. So if you remember back from the last section, we talked about the fact that in this particular example, we have three populations. So let me just kind of draw them real quick. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is population 1, right? So these could be the three states that we're studying. For instance, this is population number 2, and then we have population 3. Right? And in the last section, I taught you that these populations, we have other words for them in Anova. You can call them treatments. So treatment 1, treatment 2, treatment 3, or you also refer to them as groups, group 1, group 2, and group 3. And in the last section, the sum of squares among treatments was basically how do these different sample means that we have here, because don't forget, we do some sampling. We pull a subset of people out and we get a value, x bar 1. We pull a subset people out here and we call x bar number 2, and we pull a subset of people that we sample here, we call it x bar 3, and we're studying the average values of these means here as a way to study the population means, right? So the sum of squares among treatments was all about looking at how these different means behave relative to the grand mean. The variation of these means relative to the grand mean, which is everything together, trying to see if any of these guys are pokeouts, trying to see if any of them are significantly far apart from the baseline, which is the whole point of Anova, right? So now that's a backdrop. That's what we studied first. Now what we're going to do is we're going to dive inside each individual population and study what the exact data values are doing inside of each population. So whereas before we were just talking about the means and looking at those, now we're going to dive in and start looking at the variation of the individual sample data from each population. And the bottom line is, we have something called the sum of squares of errors, and I'm going to go ahead and write down what it is, even though you won't really quite understand it. We call it SSE, and that's sum of squares of errors. You'll understand by the end of this lesson why it's called, oops, error has another R in it, why it's called an error. But basically, it's the variation resulting from the variance within the populations. So as before, we were looking at how these means vary relative to the baseline. So we're looking at the big picture before. Now we're diving in and we're seeing how does this sample, how do the individual samples vary relative to its own population that it comes from. So in other words, another way of looking at this is, yeah, we can boil this sample data down to a mean, but when you really look at the data values, do they come from well-behaved data set, which means, in other words, are the data values tightly packed around, the sample mean that we calculated, or is the data all over the place? Is it just like you threw paint at a wall and the data is just everywhere, all over the map? Because as you might guess, if you get data that's all over the map and just everywhere, then you may not trust it too much. It may look a little bit like random noise. You get an average value from it, but it might look more like random noise and not a cohesive data set, something that you would really trust. So this is going to answer the question. The sum of squares of errors is basically going to tell us, is the individual data sets that we got, are they really well behaved or not? And it's going to influence the calculation in Anova to test our hypothesis. So the easiest way to really show what I'm talking about is by way of an example. And I like using class grades. So let's go over here and say we have class 1 grades. So whereas before we were talking about 3 states, New York and Texas and so on, now we're just going to talk about a simpler example just to get the idea across. We're going to look at class number 1 and class number 2. Class number 1 has the following grades on a math test or a science test. A grade of 25, that guy didn't do very well. A grade of 50, that's pretty failing grade. 75, this person didn't try at all, he had only a 5. And this person had a 95, so that person scored an A. What is the average value of all of these, right? Because this could be the sample data that we pull from a population. Maybe population 1 is a school in Houston, and population 2 could be a school in Tennessee or something. So anyway, we're going to sample. In this case, we pulled 5 grades. So what's the average value here? If we look at X bar from class number 1, how do we find the average value? It's just 25 plus 50 plus 75 plus 5 plus 95. Those are what we